this.
Ready to go on? Are you online? You're broadcasting? Okay. This is a call to order of the Governance Committee of the Bridgeport Board of Education. Today's date is Monday, May 2nd, 2022. The time is 6 p.m. In attendance are myself, John Weldon, Committee Chair, Committee Member Joseph Lombard, and Board Member Joseph Sokolovic. Also present is Superintendent Michael Testani. First order of business is approval of minutes, March 7, 2022. Is there a motion to approve?
Guess so moved.
I'll second. Any discussion?
No.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Second item, discussion and possible referral to the full board of revised policy regarding public comment. Last we talked about this at the regular board meeting a week ago. There was some issue taken with the newly inserted language in paragraph 2A6. That language was to protect the impartiality of the board. Is there anyone, board members participating online? No, I don't see any. To protect the impartiality of the board will not hear public comment that involves a complaint about a Board of Education personnel, students, personnel action, student disciplinary matter, or pending litigation. Anyone who has a complaint or grievance regarding a specific employee may take the matter up with the superintendent so that the proper and applicable procedure may be followed. So, there was issue with that, and I think, I don't know, you guys want to read that through yourselves one or two more times before we start talking about it. This, by the way, was language specifically provided by CAVE's staff attorney. So this was not self-crafted. This was cookie cutter from CAVE.
So my question, just as a, I guess, observer on this, because since it's not my policy, but is we pay for the organization CAVE, we pay for other organizations. Lean on them when we have questions. And then we question the recommendations.
I'm wondering if maybe the way it's worded, is there some clunkiness that is maybe making it being interpreted a different way than it's intended? You know, a comma can make a difference.
My
It's
take on the comments at the meeting were more around making sure that there was a venue for the board to become aware of issues. And specifically in that particular meeting, regardless of who is the superintendent at the time, in this wording, it says it should be taken up with the superintendent. But if it's regarding the superintendent, what is the current mechanism for complaints to be filed or expressed or shared?
Well, I don't think there really is one.
Right.
I mean, the way I'm looking at this is if someone has an issue, general issue, they can come to public comment and they can talk about it. This language is designed to protect employees, students, and any personnel matters. I mean, I suppose we could insert some language that is to the effect of, while we will receive any comment or complaint on general matters relating to the school system, in specific, personnel stuff is off limits, for lack of a better term.
Ms. Baptiste Perez.
Let the record reflect Ms. Baptiste Perez has joined the meeting.
I also think specifying that what I think is being referred to by the clause involves a complaint I think that is referring to an existing filed complaint, right? It's not just, I'm not sure if it does or not. That's why I think it's a little unclear. So the very first sentence, to protect the impartiality, the board will not hear comment that involves a complaint. So
Okay.
is that meaning that involves the person complaining about, or involves an existing complaint filed, is that?
That means you can't file a complaint against a specific person, a specific staff member, whether there's an existing personnel matter or not.
But is that filing a complaint or just discussing and open?
Yeah, if you're going to the podium and you're making a complaint about someone,
I see.
but it says there in the bottom, if you have a complaint about a staff member, you need to take that to the superintendent, not the board, because that complaint may result in a grievance that we might wind up hearing. So that's why it directs you to go to the proper channel.
And again, I'll just say again that I think that one of the concerns that was expressed is that at least to some degree, there was the thought that the board should be aware of some things where they may never be aware, unless of course it comes to the level of the board. And maybe that's important to distinguish. Maybe the board does not need to become aware of these things or not. But if it's stopped and not allowed to be shared at the podium, that general environment would never be understood by the board.
Well, see, now here's an example. Somebody, in fact, it a couple of weeks ago, and it's due to be put on the facilities committee agenda. There was an issue raised about bathrooms in Harding. That's a complaint about something going on in the day-to-day. There's nothing wrong with hearing that. But if someone were to come to the board and try to allege that something was being done specifically by the principal, whether that may or may not be the case, that's something we don't need to hear. We need to hear that, hey, there's a problem operationally. And Mr. Testani is supposed to get to the bottom of it, find out who's at fault, and if there's supposed to be, and if disciplinary action is needed, then he's supposed to make sure that that happens. And we're not supposed to know the personalities involved unless the grievance winds up coming back to us. You follow?
I do, I follow.
Okay. So maybe that kind of needs to be delineated.
The scary part is, and I'm only going to speak because we've had it presented now at the last two board meetings. When there's disciplinary action being taken against an employee for failure to perform their duties, there's a process that we go through. And in the midst of that process, to have, and I'm going to say it on the record because it needs to be clear, to have a family member stand up in 2 meetings, not identify themselves as a family member, and speak for 2 and then 4 minutes, make all kinds of accusations to try to save the family member from the discipline rather than let the process play out with their collective bargaining unit, I think is problematic. And if I had not done some investigating, because some of the things said at last week's meeting just seemed very odd, that only somebody would get that from the individual themselves, and did some investigation to identify this person as basically a family member, that's problematic. Because it just, what if then we transfer a custodian from one school to the next and he didn't want to be transferred? Now he has somebody come up there yelling and screaming, you can't take that person from our school. He's so valuable to our school. And it's not a parent. It's not the principal advocating, because they wouldn't do that. It's the person's cousin. I mean, that's pretty.
And the other concern that I would have is somebody's just got an axe to grind with somebody. Principal, disciplines a teacher, and that teacher is just livid with it. And and they get their supporters together and they just start lambasting that principal by name, publicly, on the record. That's a problem. So that's why I think it talks about complaints being made about named, people.
Right.
Named people. It's not saying you can't make a complaint about an issue and then let somebody investigate and find out who the individual responsible for the problem is. That's a whole different story.
Well,
So
that is important because if sometimes they don't call the principal, for example. Today I received a call from a parent, I returned the call, and they hadn't spoken to the assistant principal nor the principal. They came right to me. I acknowledged, told them I would bridge a communication with the principal, and the issue was resolved. The immediate complaint was the school hasn't done anything. The school wasn't made aware, the principal wasn't made aware, neither was the assistant principal to address what was happening with the teacher. But if we automatically then say now the teacher tomorrow is uncovered because it's a pretty serious allegation of how they spoke to a student and the words that were used is now put on disciplinary measures while we investigate further. And now Monday we have people out there yelling and screaming in support of the teacher. Where does it stop? Because I think we're starting to see that build now. That this is your way of getting what you want. You just show up at a board meeting and start saying stuff, whether it's true or not. It taints the investigation as well.
Well, I think that's also another aspect of this, separate from the specifics that we're talking about, but almost like a filibuster, or, where over and over, and taking 2, 4, 6 minutes, and then at the next meeting, the same topic. If it's been, I understand that on both sides. If you feel like you're not getting anywhere, you want to say it again. At the same time, things have a process and things take time. You've spoken your piece, it's on the record. To have that same presentation, let's say, every 2 weeks, I think that's a separate issue, not addressed here.
but I think when I look at this, while we talk about this, that you can't do this, we don't clarify about an issue that you can make a complaint about.
Ms. Baptiste Perez has a hand.
Okay. Mr. Sokolovic and then Ms.
No,
Baptiste.
he's a committee member. Yeah.
Go ahead, Ms. Baptiste Perez.
I had a few. Is the attorney from Bertram Moses is going to attend this meeting? I was under
No,
the-
I wanted to get us talking about what our ultimate goals were before we start pulling in outside counsel. Like, what are we trying to achieve here? Like, what are your concerns and what are you trying to achieve? Whatever language.
I want to just reiterate back to what Mr. Lombard had said regarding the impartiality of the board. I've brought this up several times when it's been brought to the general board, is that we do need to at least be aware of the information. Impartiality of the board is not equivalent to ignorance as to what's going on. And if we make a referral to go through the appropriate channels and individuals may feel like the appropriate channels are being ignored, whether it's true or not, it comes into our purview as board members to look into that when we're evaluating the superintendent. Also, I think what needs to be emphasized is that it's being read into the language, but it's not there. If we're going to say named individuals, then the language in the actual bylaws should say named individuals. Outstanding litigation versus just general litigation, because when you have it the way it is now, it's broad and has a chilling impact. And I've said this, that the chilling impact on this particular district,
so what impact?
we don't, chilling, meaning it
Chilling.
stifles people from wanting to participate. And we haven't seen on many occasions too many or I won't say too many, but we haven't seen a substantial turnout during public speaking to want to limit this speech.
So I think that's a crucial aspect. I didn't even realize that word was no longer in there about having it phrased as named personnel.
No, it's not there as named person.
I see that. I just marked it in there. I didn't realize it
But
was
the same goes for named students, because
Mhm.
when you read it, to protect the impartiality of the board will not hear public comment that involves a complaint about the Board of Education personnel, students, a personnel action. And I think if we're going to think about impartiality, the naming aspect of it, but complaints about students, student behaviors, that comes in the purview of developing policies.
That's a good point.
So, like, for example, you can't name, Billy is giving, Billy Smith is bullying my child, because you're naming him specifically. But you can say, there's a bullying issue at this school, and somebody needs to be looking into this. You're talking about a student issue, but you're not naming a specific student publicly like that.
Mhm.
All right, I'm taking notes here.
The other thing she talked about was open litigation. I don't think there's the other. I think where it says a personnel
Well,
action, I'm not sure where,
It's called,
pending.
it says pending, we could call it open or pending
Well,
litigation.
the thing about open and pending litigation is whether it's in suit or not.
Right, and that's what I'm saying. Like, if somebody has submitted a demand letter, that's a potential litigation. That's probably not something we want to be talking about, because step has been taken in that direction.
Yeah, but we wouldn't talk about it. It would.
Well, no,
literally
we don't want somebody coming to the podium and saying, just so you know, I've submitted a demand letter. Would you agree with that?
Well,
Let's say John Smith has submitted a demand letter for $100,000 for a slip and fall. And he comes to the podium and says that. And you need to take care of this now. That, I would say, that's not something that we would want to hear. That's a pending litigation, and it needs to follow its due course with our legal representation. Do you agree with that? And not be brought to us.
I mean, it's going to be public information regardless. If there's a lawsuit against the Board of Ed, that's public information on the docket.
That's true, but but my point is that at some point it may come to us for a settlement. And if we've already been approached by the plaintiff, now that's going to bias us. If 6 months from now, a year from now, we're sitting in a room trying to come up with a settlement.
I don't think the likelihood of that.
I guess it's hard as an attorney to see how knowledge of a lawsuit is going to make you biased towards settlement.
Well, we can circle it, and now that we're getting these things down, we can get, our attorney's opinion on these things as we're talking about them.
Yeah, I don't, in the scenario you just raised, I don't see it likely that someone who's suing the district is going to get up there. Their attorney would probably tell them not to go to public comments and comment. I just asked the question about what do we do in situations where you have supervisors, you have folks that are trying to hold staff accountable, and there is a grievance process that they are afforded, and we find a parade like we did of an individual to show up and just start spewing off things that may or may not be accurate at all.
And I think we just talked about that. As Baptiste Perez noted that the operative word of name
Is individual.
personnel
Gotcha.
was not there. So if
Gotcha.
we insert that, I think that changes the whole read of that.
Sure.
Okay.
Mr. Scullin, yes.
Scholar.
Okay,
Brett?
was it on?
I didn't take the, yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
All right, yeah, I think added some of the language that you just spoke of, narrowing it as much as possible is great. And I think that'll be helpful. There's also some things that, Mr. Lombard stated that he has trouble with, which I think I've got a suggestion for rectifying. Because all the employees under Mr. Testani and everything, there's a grievance procedure for them and a way for them to talk to somebody and go up through a chain of command. We are the only chain of command above Mr. Testani. So if somebody has a complaint about the superintendent, they should be able to bring it to the podium if they something. Not sorry to throw you under the bus, but that's
No.
that's
I agree. If they have a complaint about me, but I think having a complaint about me holding a staff member accountable who has a process is a totally different story. So if somebody comes up and says, I called Mr. Testani's office 5 times to complain about a situation where my son's being bullied, Testani never returns my call. That should be paid.
now this is one of my issue with even with the process that we're just hearing now. If you've got a solid complaint that comes to us inside an arbitration hearing or whatever they call it, the settlement hearing that we approve whatever the arbitrator said or whatever have you, and your personal director has good notes, good evidence, I think we as intelligent individuals could put that aside and say, hey, that's a case. Because frankly, if the president of the United States comes out to support somebody, he's a great guy, but they got all the evidence against them in the hearing, we should be able to put that aside and just good. Because I mean, I understand if the case is strong, you shouldn't worry about us hearing positive things about the personnel employee. That's being
We're talking about the superintendent.
right. Yeah, no, I was talking about the overall piece.
Again, the overall, I think we we'll hear it when it's appropriate for us to hear it. And we may never hear it because it'll get resolved somewhere along the step process. But until it's gone through its total process, I don't think it's appropriate for us to be hearing anything about it. There's an established grievance process for every employee, and it needs to be followed. And it can't be trumped by us. If it gets to our level, that's another story.
So that's like,
And we can overturn his decision.
but if you look at us like at the situation like a court of law, judges are very reluctant to put preemptive restrictions on speech with the media and all that. I mean, you got murder cases and they're saying, oh, Jack is such a nice guy, he wouldn't kill nobody and all this and that. And the jurors see this and they still got to put that aside and say that. I mean, even though it's an active case with somebody's actual maybe life on the line in a penalty case or something.
Understanding where you're going with this, what you're trying to do.
So we're talking about hearing things that would possibly influence us.
But are you thinking removing all that altogether? That whole.
No, I'm thinking we got to protect ourselves against creating a hostile employee environment.
Mhm.
But in the same vein, we shouldn't preemptively stop people from speaking in support of somebody else. So with somebody's favorite teacher, you know they've been suspended. Don't know where they are. I don't see the problem with genuine students, parents having an outcry, whether the person is guilty or not, being charged with whatever contractual violations. Like saying, oh, that's my favorite teacher. Where is she? What is she doing? And they name the teacher by name, even though they may be under discipline or whatever have you. And we're going to tell them, no, you can't speak out in support of that teacher that you see missing.
Yes.
That's a severe restriction on this.
No, I say yes, because then if the disciplinary action, if the grievance comes to our level, We're not basing our decision on the merits of the case. We're allowing ourselves to be influenced by people who are just supportive. And we shouldn't be hearing anything about it until it comes right to our door. And our attorney would tell us that if he were here. You cannot be hearing anything about it. You can't even know it exists until it comes to your doorstep.
Right. For instance,
You really can't.
Right. For instance, with one of the recent things with
I think,
I'm trying not to be specific about.
I think to your point, though, it's a little different if you come up and say, Ms. Baptiste Perez is my favorite teacher. She helped me out, everything. Boom. Great.
Or we need her back or something.
Right. I miss her. I do well with her. It's another story to say, Ms. Baptiste Perez is my favorite teacher. The superintendent, blah, 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 or the principal is this and that. We demand, like, now it becomes, okay. It's now the principal will call me if it's a principal and say, what do you want me to do here? And I can't tell the person, we want to stop this at the board meeting, so just let it slide. Because then all of a sudden, every time you get chaos. So in the instance you brought up, it ended up working itself out. But the process never got started.
But I'm thinking about behind the influence thing for yourself or whatever have you, that not bringing the case because it's coming to the board level and we may be influenced. Say, God forbid, and a staff member assaults a student. And it's everybody's favorite teacher. And they're like, oh man, bring her back. She shouldn't have hit the kid or whatever have you. And kid's a little instigator or whatever. When we go behind those closed doors, do you really think we're going to cave to public pressure with such a severe case, with such evidence, and say, put the teacher back, she's well loved?
I would hope not.
And I would hope a principal or superintendent will still prosecute that case no matter what the community turnout is.
Absolutely. I would. It's just an awkward place to be because you look around the room sometimes and you don't know what everyone's thinking. So you're like, okay, how many more weeks am I going to sit here?
That's my 2 cents. I just got concerned about the preemptive speech. Maybe we could bring that up with the attorney. I'll side with the attorney. Whatever the attorney says, I'll be happy to go with. But I do suggest adding with the exception of the superintendent part to the complaints, to the lack of or whatever have you. Got the exact language.
That's pretty much everything for now.
That's all I got.
All right, so I'll meld something like this together and send it to our attorney, see if he's got any feedback. Okay. Next on the agenda is discussion and possible referral board revised policy regarding field trips. This was something Mr. Castani.
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to be able to go to the full board after tonight.
No. Maybe an ongoing.
Okay,
Next time.
So we do have policy 6201, and then it goes on into R-6201A. One of the things that's become evident is that schools begin and plan. Is that? Oh, Mr. Bennett.
Oh, Mr. Benahan's here. Benahan, you have your hand up?
No.
You just want us to know that. Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Ben? Okay, Mr. Benahan is here for the record.
So I think when we're talking about field trips that, number one, require significant financial cost to families, and that are more than one day, they're overnight or out of state, or if so be it, out of the country at any point, that there should be an approval prior to the planning, the distribution of materials, and the collection of money. I know that then later on in the current field trip packet, it asks for the names of the students, their phone numbers and all this other stuff. But I think that the trip needs to be approved rather than wait until the 11th hour for a principal then to bring it forth. And there's no recourse if the board denies it for the families.
So the board, before you go through all the hoops.
Right, right.
And
So
my question is, I don't see in either of these where is there a board approval required?
Yes,
I didn't see it.
It's there.
the out-of-state travel,
Page.
the last page. So these things are, we usually bring overnight and out-of-state trips must receive Bridgeport Board of Education approval. The last sentence and the whole policy.
You're missing the whole section.
So
So you
it's asking in this field trip request form to have list of students and emergency numbers, list of chaperones, name and telephone number of transportation company, and overnight accommodations and sites. I think we can come back with that at a later date, just so that you have an understanding of who the individuals are and everything else. Make sure that the proper paperwork has all the I's dotted and T's crossed. By the time in here, it must be submitted at least 30 days in advance. There's no option for reimbursement of funding in 99% of the cases at that point, if the board chooses not to approve the trip. And, you know, then there's the overnight and there's the nonstop, it's come into some discussion. What a non-school sponsored trip is. I think that looks fine. I did do some digging after Monday night's board meeting that Massac High School sent a group of students to Germany this past April. And I spoke to the superintendent. He emailed me back then in writing that it was a non-school sponsored trip, to the point where they couldn't even use copy paper or the copier at the school to make any copies. That it had to be done, and they couldn't have any meetings. They couldn't advertise meetings. It was clearly non-school sponsored at the risk of the individual that organized. So I think just saying, take this group of students to Orlando.
We have
entire
a
eighth
thing
grade.
now. There's a group that wants to go to Boston in June
For the day.
for the day, but it's out of state.
Right,
So it requires board approval.
right,
But June 9th is a month away.
right.
And so what's going to happen
If you say
for
no,
whatever reason, we say no, and they're in the 11th hour of whatever contracts for busing or tickets they bought for places they're going to see, whatever. Now they're just, for lack of a better term, screwed.
correct.
And that was not, but if this was done, 2 months ago when the idea first circulated, and then at that point we said, no, that's no good. Well, no money was collected, no harm, no foul. Better luck next time. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, John, I don't, do the committee members have anything for us? I got some.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Did you have anything? He's deferring to committee members first.
Okay, yeah. I was actually going to defer to Lynn.
Okay, I'm going to defer to Ms. Baptiste Perez.
Yeah.
You have anything to say?
No.
Are you muted?
Yeah, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. I have the heat on in my office, so it's loud. It depends on how early in the process the board gets involved, because we've seen with some of the field trips that's come up, different agencies have different timelines. And so, and I think either we're going to have a more active role if we're going to look into trying to stop or refund or decide in any particular part or phase that a field trip's not going to go through. I think all requests must be submitted at least 30 days in advance. that language could be revised to say all requests must be submitted at least 30 days in advance before the expiration of refunds or before the that particular language becomes void and people won't get the money back for the trip. It just depends on how active or passive the board role would be, but that's something just to take into consideration. Also, I think we should take a look at this, not only from overnight out of state, but out of country. I think it is a significant difference when you're leaving the jurisdiction of the United States of America. You have different countries with different laws. Yeah, it's somewhat similar with different states having different laws, but you're still within the United States. And I think something should be acknowledged for abroad trips because there are different inherent risks associated with that. That's not identified in the policy.
To Ms. Baptiste Perez's point, I am inclined not to submit for approval international trips just because the liability to the school district is enormous. There has been a case in Connecticut that was recently settled in, I believe, 2017 on a trip to China where a young 14-year-old student was bit by an insect that is on an excursion, became extremely ill, will have long-lasting effects, and it was ruled after it went through appeals for damages and $41 million and were paid out to the family. So it's concerning, but it's ultimately your decision if you will approve that. But the liability is large, especially when it's a small group of children and it's not accessible to everyone. You know, it's one thing when the entire class of 8th graders goes to Washington, has an option to go to Washington, or you're going to take the entire 6th grade to nature's classroom. But when you have a school, let's say Central High School with 1,600 kids, and only 15 kids have access to possibly going on an international trip, to me, I don't see where the educational value is to the overall student body. It's really just who can afford to go and not really based on any other equitable access to the trip. But I mean, it's really up to the board if they will approve those trips. But again, I think to Ms. Baptiste Perez's point, at least 30 days prior to full refund being issued by available or something, because
I think we should be the first step in the process.
right, here's a preliminary, you got the okay to plan it.
This is what our plan is. Would you approve this? Would you approve this for us to pursue it? If we say yeah, then they go through the checklist. We don't need to, I don't think, we don't need to approve it afterwards. Because if they go through the checklist and you're signing off, you've got the final sign off that all the insurance is there, all the permission slips, up. You're saying all the criteria has been met, and we blessed it at the onset. Then that's probably the way it should go. Because I know I don't want to be in a position where, you know, it's happened before. You know, we've only got 3 days to approve this, or we're going to lose all our money. Well,
In the most recent approval of the Washington DC trip, that trip was supposed to be taken, I believe, this week. And when it got to me, it was cutting it close, and I did not bring it to the full board and told them they needed to push it out far enough in advance so you guys could get an opportunity to vet it through teaching and learning as well, because it's supposed to be an educational trip. It's not just to go.
yeah, it's not vacation.
Right. So if that's the case, do we want it to go through teaching and learning as well as a step? to make sure it's vetted before it goes to the full board, or you want it just to go to the full board?
I think whichever way it goes, whenever it gets to the full board, that just needs to be the first step.
Okay.
Whether it's teaching and learning followed by the board or straight to the board, whichever way you do it, I don't care. But either of those mechanisms need to be step one.
Okay.
Ms. Baptiste Perez?
Yeah, I just had a general comment regarding that, because I know one of the items, for example, with the Washington DC field trip, is that we have it in 6201, is that field trips must include an evaluation of the experience with follow-up classroom activities to reinforce the educational value of the trip. But in that particular example, it's pushed so far out that the last day of the trip is the last day of school. And so there is no reinforcement of the educational value of the trip, aside from the students having it. But I think that's just more consideration. And I don't want to necessarily foreclose opportunities to students, especially within Bridgeport, to leave Bridgeport, Connecticut and see the United States or the world beyond it. As a former public school student, the first, or some of the earliest exposures to there's a world beyond the state I lived in came through in school. And so I don't want to be necessarily over harsh that the school experience is to broaden and enlighten our students into curiosity about the world and become scholarly and just know that there's a world beyond Connecticut. I think the notice in advance is key to being able to make educated and informed decisions when evaluating it. And to ensure that it is something of value where students are going to be able to have something memorable and educational. It's this in particular, I think it could use some fleshing out. And so that way, I don't want to stop kids in Bridgeport, and I am aware of some of the liability issues with abroad travel, but it was, it just has to be properly vetted. If we're going to be involved early as a board, I don't think being involved early and giving them a checklist is going to do it. I think just proper follow-up, however it works through us, needs to be done to ensure that the trip is accurate, it's performed to a T, there's no issues, and if an issue pops up, everybody should be able to get reimbursed in a timely manner. But that's all I have right now.
What else?
Yeah, this was something the superintendent brought up, and I don't think he was even on here. It's just a separate discussion or topic of the field trips that are out of reach economically for most students. And so they really become a select group that can afford it, based on what you said. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting, it's not what we're talking about today with this policy, I don't think, but I think it's a really, that's an example where there might be something that's not a school sponsored trip. If you have parents that can afford to send your kids to Taiwan, they could do that. They could have their friends, their classmates could go, but not a school sponsored trip. Whereas if it's a school sponsored trip, there should be equal access, even if it was a fundraiser or something like that. Those who were interested.
Opportunities to explore and be exposed and learn right here in the United States. You know, I don't think necessarily we have to make this grandiose heavy burden to a select few.
Well, I actually, just to say something about that, that's not what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
And I think to go to Arizona is expensive too. You know, it may not cost the same as going to
all
Taiwan.
relative.
It's all relative, and there are dangerous scorpions in the desert in Arizona. You know, but there's good studying to be done there, and maybe even in Washington D.C. there's some dangerous things. But so I'm not at all trying to undercut the value of these trips. That's not what I mean to say. I'm just pointing out one aspect that you brought up, which is separate from this policy, which is just another discussion. I think I'm all set.
Joe?
Yeah, I got a few suggestions throughout the policy because it hasn't been looked at in a while and there's some outdated language and stuff. So if you don't mind, I'll go through a little piece by piece.
Please do.
6201E, we got the language of assistant superintendent for the approval process when we have no longer assistant superintendents, whatever the appropriate title is.
Do you want to just leave it open to your
General.
respective supervisor?
Generic.
Probably better, yeah. More generic, the better.
Okay.
Then 6201A. Indemnification. Okay, compliance with procedures will form the basis for determining whether individual staff members are entitled to be indemnified and represented in the event that there's litigation resulting from the incident on a school trip. Staff members who, okay. See, now this is where I'm having problems. I don't know where exactly to clean up the language, but let's hold off on the indemnification until we go to page, sorry, 5D, school trip sponsored by an outside organization. If a trip is sponsored by an outside organization and not by the Bridgeport Public Schools, parents must be explicitly advised of this fact, and all documentations relating to this trip must so indicate. That's entirely too vague to me. I mean, what's the difference? If it seems the only thing that's a difference is not being approved by the Bridgeport Board of Education. I mean, teachers like us, we're board members, correct? Everywhere we go and every time we speak, we're cautioned against speaking as people will perceive us as board members and representing the board.
I agree.
And I think the same case is with teachers. If a teacher is sitting there talking about a field trip with students in her class or his class, you can't separate the teacher
From the school.
from the school. So just the simple fact of the teacher planning it, even if it's in a cafe somewhere with 12 students in their class, that's still going to be connected back in the school because they've always connected with the teacher in the school and everything filtered through. And that could possibly have like sideways liability towards us as the acting agent. Now, we don't have control over outside entities and people planning stuff and things, but what we could control is
Staff involved.
staff involvement with children in their classrooms. So if some language could be inserted there,
Staff will not
that,
involve.
any, not totally exclusionary, but all staff members wishing to participate in an outside field trip must have permission from either the Board of Ed or the superintendent.
Well, but
This way we get a second glance at who.
So I'm a teacher and I work for Lighthouse after school, and it's a Lighthouse trip. I'm working as a Lighthouse person, so I have to let the superintendent's office or the board should be aware that these kids that I'm going with, I'm going as a Lighthouse, and the board is off.
Right, absolutely. And if it's an outside organization that's not Lighthouse or something have you, and it's still a good trip, to look at that trip and to give the piece of teacher permission, we can ensure that that outside trip fits in with all our parameters without putting on outside rules on outside sponsors. Because when I hear sponsor, I think somebody who's paying for something.
Can I ask a question about that, James?
Sure.
I think you may know where I'm going. But so even in the situation where it was approved by the board that this staff member, this teacher, could go on this trip with an outside sponsor, an outside organization, how do we sever all liability if something happens with our students, with our teacher, and an outside planned that we said okay to, that they could go on?
No, we said the teachers could go.
The teacher could go.
We said the teacher
So we're
could go.
cutting our ties with that teacher. We're saying you're not our teacher now.
Well, that was one of the things that the union was very adamant about, is that, personal liability can come into play for those folks if they're not part of covered under the school. So for example, students go all the time on college tours with VIP. They're all run through VIP, the permission slips, the money and everything. So we're not involved at all.
That's clear.
That's great. So if they were going to take them on, to California, and rather than a bus trip, they were going to use airplanes, it would be the same thing. I think in the indemnification, we should also put Board of Ed, not just City of Bridgeport.
Yes, definitely. And also the liability points. We should be able to craft something that protects us from all liabilities, especially now. When I hear you say you're not approving international trips and equity, equity is a key word for me. But some of the chances, even for the kids who can afford it, through the discounts through these organizations, that's the only way they're going to go out. And when these children who can afford it come back, they'll be talking to the kids in their class about their trip who couldn't afford it, and they'll know somebody who has done it and give them something to aspire to and think there's things out there maybe through somebody else's eyes. I mean, and also there's also chances. I know every time one of our interdistrict come up with a field trip for approval, one of the questions I ask, how many students are from Bridgeport and how many students are the suburbs? And there's always Bridgeport students included in those trips. So there are many in Bridgeport and in the area that do have the means. And I don't think equity is taking it away from somebody who can afford to do something, but trying to bring people up who can't afford it to be able to afford it and participate.
I feel like, I don't know if it was presented that you will be able to go if all of a sudden you'd have 120 kids saying they want to go to Spain. But I feel like it should be the kind of thing where if this trip is going to happen, those who pass all the other standards and express the interest and maybe write the essay or whatever, will be able to go. I feel like I'm not saying that's how it has to be, but when we talk about equity, it feels like they need that leg up. And someone else can afford. It seems to be needs to be something.
Yeah, now you're talking to the finance guy. That would become unaffordable for the district.
Well, I don't mean the district. I'm saying
There is no discount.
Yeah.
These tour companies charge dollar for dollar. If you and I were going to go, we would pay the same. It's not like the kids are getting a special deal.
Right. And that's not what I was implying. I was thinking more of a team effort. Those people who are on the same page and want to do the same thing. Not everyone wants to go to the same country and do the same trip. Those people who really express that interest, that they find a way together to make it work for everybody.
I'm looking at it more from the district liability angle. Things can get infinitely more complicated from a legal perspective and even a logistics perspective when you go international and even more so overseas. Something could happen where somebody winds up being stuck someplace 3,000 miles across an ocean, and it's no easy feat to get them back. We read about it in the news with sports figures, and it's just, and I don't think it's something that we should be entertaining. I think if people on an individualized basis, privatized basis, want to pursue it, we can acknowledge that. I, for one, would not be interested in sponsoring anything of that.
Yeah, I still got a little more to go through.
That's I think that's a business we don't want to get in.
I disagree that we actually had something in there with ensure the passports, because we do have a large undocumented students, and that was an issue when we went to one of these classes, went to Canada, I believe. We had to ensure everybody had their documents and even traveling domestically with the real ID and stuff. Some of them can't get on a plane or what have you. And those things always kind of be looked at domestically or internationally. Anyway, let me go back to number 10. I think addresses involving unusual precautions, which is basically anything out of the country we would have to take that country's rules and regulations into account. And I think that was one of Ms. Perez's, Baptiste Perez's points. And the Superintendent Testani's points and the language about the preparation of the field trip and losing money. Sorry, that would be 11G. We should approve it before any deposits are due. And that'll clean up any day timelines or anything like that. Nobody has opportunity to lose any money if we approve it or disapprove it before any deposits are given.
So are you saying you want to give approval for them to pursue it and then final approval after they've done everything that they're supposed to?
And like if you prepare for the trip, say we want to go to, I'm going to use the international trip, Italy, and the deadline is November to put your deposit in to hold the trip. We would have to, they could have it all planned. That's something we might not approve, but there's still a chance for it to be approved if they could put on a great presentation to the board and cover all the bases that concern us.
Well, and if you want to know exactly then how many students are demographically from Bridgeport, if it's an interdistrict magnet or something like that, they can bring it back, that information, prior to the deadline for full refund.
Right.
Which from what I've been told is about 110 days out from the trip. So that's, almost.
Well, I also don't want to make this overly complicated because we already have issues where people don't follow the timeline. And it becomes a problem
That's why,
because they misinterpreted something.
right, that's why I didn't put days, because it used to be, the days used to be different, if I'm not
It
mistaken.
was 14 days.
It was 14 days, and then it was up to 30 days because it was problematic. Just putting the language before the deposit is made takes all the time out of it. It's clear, before you put money into this, it must be approved. And I think that'll be for any trips that have like a 200-day deadline, 50-day or whatever have you. And it'll be
You can
flexible.
collect the money. You just can't write the check to the touring company.
Correct.
Until this.
Well, what they do
Or
with,
deposits made to the company.
right, or deposits, because that's what they do. That's the beauty of this, unfortunately, is that then the parents are left to make payments directly to the company so that money is not collected. So they don't want school personnel doesn't want the responsibility of collecting the money. They put that on the parent with the tour company after the fact. So they pay, whether it's monthly, as they go along.
So
They just have to have it completely paid. And then they give them options of different insurances. I think it should be pretty much a blanket so that everybody's protected equal.
And then finally, I have a suggestion for E. I don't think we should have that. And I think we discussed this before, but it never made it into the revision. Overnight and out-of-state field trips. Now, we've got places in the state that are further away than New York City and close. I mean,
Probably.
I don't think I would be comfortable in leaving
Overnight.
overnight and trips over X amount of miles. I don't know what those miles, like maybe 100, 150. I don't know what, I'm not firm on the number, but I think just simply going across the border to New York or across the border.
Beyond whatever number of miles, out of state beyond.
I think is 50, 100 miles radius.
I don't know, just shooting it out there, but saying, how far is Boston? Because Boston, if it's a day trip to Boston,
Boston's like 2.
how about just overnight out of state trips?
Say what?
How about just overnight out of states rather than a radius?
That's what it said, no?
No, it says
Overnight.
overnight / out of state.
Just put overnight field trips must receive.
Overnight, just overnight.
Yeah, then, and I think that'll clean it up.
If it's out of state for the day, that's okay. It's if it's only.
Yeah, I mean, because,
Well, that's where the radius comes.
right. Yeah, you're only going to be able to travel so
Going to New
far
Rochelle.
in a day.
Right.
20 miles.
You're gonna get back.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
But if it's a radius, you
Don't
want to
even
say-
need a radius though.
If you,
Stay overnight. That's it.
if you cut out overnight.
You only
You get it, you go, if you drive in 8 hours, you're spending overnight.
Right.
If you're getting on an airplane, you're spending overnight. I think that takes care of it. Now, if you're more comfortable with maybe a time, trips involving over
Over
X
24
amount
hours or
of time,
something.
X amount of travel, X amount of hours of travel.
Maybe like you're saying, trips to lasting more than 24 hours. Something like that.
Yeah, that makmakes sense.
Because they may come and go in the same day, a long drive there.
Like an 18-hour.
Right. Yeah, because once we get going and back to normal operations, these field trips come up sometimes 2 or 3 at a time at teaching and learning. And
So overnight, say like we did Nature's Classroom or Washington, DC, we should still have that approved prior to the collection of funds. Okay. All requests must be submitted prior.
So out-of-state ones, they're going to,
yeah, and those usually involve a lot less cost anyway. And that would be under the superintendent. That would be totally under the superintendent's purview.
Yeah, like the Boston trip for the day, New York for the day.
yeah, like my senior class, we went to the financial district for the day. It was no big deal,
Wait, I know Ms. Perez.
Oh, Ms. Perez, Baptiste Perez?
Yeah, I had a few comments. Approval before deposits, I think that can be helpful. I still think there needs to be an intermediate, a middle ground step just before any deposits are refunded or needs to be refunded, that we keep an eye on it.
I agree.
I did want to clarify something for the record, because it seems just a bit foreign to me that it's not done within our schools and that there are outside organizations like VIP, but schools not taking high school students on college tours. Most of the school districts I either lived or worked in, that was a normal thing. So to know that there's outside organizations like VIP that exist, and that it's not like our guidance counselors planning trip for like the basic students to visit a college. I just want to be clear, like
They do in-state. They'll visit UConn. They'll take them to in-state colleges that are a day trip, but they don't take them out of state for overnight visiting, the Philadelphia area colleges or, the Washington, DC area colleges or anything like that. That's just something that's, as long as I've, over 20 some odd years, it's never really been something that they've taken outside of the workday to plan those type of trips. It's usually outside organizations that have worked within the schools that have responsibility.
and then, I mean, for whatever the logic, the history, it's just
Contractually, they're
I'm not familiar learning about VIP and the way it's done here in Bridgeport. I'm not familiar with it, and I'm curious as to how other districts in Connecticut, whether they're in Fairfield or Trumbull, would limit a college tour just in Connecticut, or is that a Bridgeport limitation? But just
in the other districts like Fairfield, Trumbull, parents take the kids on college visits themselves. It's not organized through the school because contractually we couldn't obligate any staff to do that.
we can obligate any staff, but if staff chose to do so, like a field trip,
Yes.
okay.
Yep, they could.
And that would fall under.
That would fall under, right, overnight field trips.
I couldn't see us like denying any teacher or should that be something that's up to the superintendent, like for approval, like allowing the teacher, like if a teacher does want to go on something like that and we put it in there, should it be under the superintendent's purview or should we?
If they wanted.
If they want to do an outside sponsored field trip.
They want to be a part of an outside sponsor?
Right, if that's going to be put in.
If they
Going to approve
do it on their own, like I mentioned, another school district did last month, everything was done. There was no meetings at the school, on school property. There was no advertising. They didn't create flyers. They didn't use copy paper. it was all done off the premises. That's a non-school sponsored trip. Somebody's taking on the liability, personal liability, rather than the school district.
Well, that would fall into the trips sponsored by outside organizations,
And,
whether it's a school, college tour, or anything else.
And I think that would explicitly be indicated on the permission slip that you are signing up for a trip to go with Mr. Albert Benahan, not with Mr. Albert Benahan, the board member or the teacher, or.
And he would have to sign something saying, he'd have to get permission from the district to go.
No, he would do it on his
I thought
own.
we said earlier. that-
Well, I mean, he could ask for permission.
No.
Just, really, he.
Yeah.
Informing us.
That's what we were just
I thought we
talking
were just
about.
talking about that.
Yeah,
The outside.
They would need
I
permission,
think he would just inform us that he's doing.
like a teacher would.
Yeah, I'm taking this trip. I'm taking students. It's not a school sponsor.
We need something to show that we were informed. Would be something formal.
Maybe have a form, have
Oh,
legal.
I misunderstood. I thought we said that the district had to give permission to the teacher.
yeah, that's what I was getting at, because I'm concerned about liability on field trips. Not so much,
Something goes wrong.
right, something goes wrong, that's
Mr.
just,
Stakalovic, is accused of some impropriety.
That's the other.
And he had nothing to do with us. We didn't sponsor this. This was the XYZ Foundation. You were just volunteering, but somebody tries to loop the district in because you're our employee. So how do we make sure that that separation occurs so that something like that happens?
Probably a legal question.
yeah, I think so, because
Yeah.
what I'm getting is like, there's agency created, and we basically, when I send my son to school, I'm under the impression my teacher's in charge. When my son goes on school trips and trips with his students, teacher's in charge. I get into something like Superintendent Hassani, he's got purchasing rights in the district or whatever have you. If he goes out on his own with a business and just purchases something without our permission, off the radar and sells it, we still got to pay that. We still got to pay that person because he was representing us.
Mhm.
They didn't know he went off and went rogue.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of things. Sorry to use it for example, but just right there.
That's fine. No, I get what you're saying. I'll ask legal to see if there would be something that we'd have the, staff member just fill out and sign that.
That would actually satisfactorily lay down a firewall,
Right.
really make a difference.
The staff member, not the students and families, because they're going to be
That's their own
exclusively.
thing.
Okay, Mr.
Well,
Bennett.
I have a comment, and I don't want to keep my hand up for a long time again. Sorry.
Bennett has had his hand up for a while.
That's okay. She can go.
Sure. Okay, go ahead. Go
I'm
ahead.
just trying to think of like hypotheticals, because if we have outside organizations like VIP, and that's because it's just thrown out there taking our students elsewhere, I don't think it's that difficult to draft language demonstrating like the authorities. So if we were to allow them, here, use this office next to the guidance counselor, you can promote what you're doing in your school. But I did take a quick glance at the Connecticut 2017 case. That case seems to be very spot on with the duty to warn or protect against the risks associated with it. So for out-of-state college trips, I think being very clear about the risks, taking precautions necessary to ensure the safety and welfare of children. That case in 2017 was negligence-based, and it depends on the particular type of risk or issue. So international trips, like for example, prime example is we wouldn't be supporting international field trips at this particular time to Russia or Ukraine for obvious reasons. And being very clear as to that. But if we're giving, or even to a certain extent, encouraging other organizations because we want to reduce our liability, draft in language that's clear that by participating, this program, it could be a different program too. This program has events in our school. Lighthouse has events in our school. Caribe has events in our schools. 100 Girls Lead-In has events in our schools. And if there's any kind of particular field trip in there, there's language that can carve out reduced liability and create a tower of insurance that before you even think to sue the school board, you need to have a parent or whoever, of course it wouldn't be a child, be a guardian, that the school has already said they're not liable, and there's indemnification from the actual organization in charge of it. And so I don't want it to be limiting, is that, yeah, no, we Bridgeport, we just don't support any out of country field trips because we don't want to take on the risk, although that is an option. But I don't want it to also be, well, we Bridgeport, we're not going to support any organization that may look to do something out of state because of it. I think there's a lot of ways to prevent the saying of, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck. Are ducks 6 feet tall? Can ducks talk? There's ways to have legal draft language where if we're trying to separate ourselves but promote those types of opportunities still to our students, it's available. And so it just sounded a little bit to me that it was, let's avoid everything for liability. Everything in life is going to involve a risk. We can this sounds like a bad example, but we could send a trip to Beardsley School and there's an accident on the bus. We can't 100% escape liability every single time. And so being responsible, and it seems like the case law is being very clear with warning about the particular risks and who's liable is an option. So I think that just requires a discussion in more detail with educational attorneys responsible for that.
Yeah, we do allow, like, for VIP or those folks, we allow them to promote it, but it's clear on the flyer that, they're handing out, this is a VIP trip, there's nowhere on there it says Bridgeport Board of Education. So I mean.
But I think the issue we were talking about is what if, Mr. Lombard
works for VIP.
is involved.
Or works for them.
Gets himself involved in that trip. And now he's got kind of a dual role here. It could be something as simple as us being named as an additionally insured, just by virtue of his involvement. The fact that he was involved, now we need to be an additionally insured on VIP's policy.
Okay.
Yeah, not only an additionally insured, but also just have the language there. We're not responsible for it. And even in the case that we're an AI, we're additionally insured by the VIP program. So I think protecting ourselves both ways would matter.
Okay.
Thank
you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Tasani, I have some question because I know we want to clear more when we talk more about this, and I want to be clear exactly your answer. We always have policy and protocol for each trip, or just depend on where the trip's gonna be to be approved, or the policy or the protocol is the same way for any kind of trip.
Well, there's different. If it's a day trip to New York, it doesn't need board approval. It just needs to be signed off and to make sure that everything on the checklist has been handed in and it's accurate. If it's an overnight trip to Philadelphia, then it does need to be board approved.
Okay. And when it's about to refund the money, almost the same thing with the protocol and the policy. It just depends exactly where the trip have to go, or it's not mandatory to refund back. If it's back.
That's why we're trying to prevent the district from having to refund any dollars if the trip is approved by the Board of Ed prior to monies being collected. Then anything that happens later on is at the risk of the family. But given the circumstances, right now there's some loose language in here that needs to be tightened up. That sometimes people try to manipulate using language and responses to questions that were not specific to certain instances.
Okay, thank you. And when it's a trip like that, the parents and the student have to sign, the permission slip, or it's a contract or something they can understand exactly,
Well, the parent signs.
Process.
Well, the parent signs I don't know if they're always reading all the fine print or not, just like, I mean, it's really their responsibility.
Yeah.
And to ask a lot of questions. That's why I think these are very complicated situations where we all probably, except for maybe Ms. Baptiste Perez as an attorney, or sometimes we don't read all the fine print on certain things that we put our signature to and then find out the hard way later on. On what action or recourse we have if something goes wrong.
And my last one is it's always had to be first come to the committee and then we go to the board to approve it.
Well, that's what we're discussing. If do we want to bring it to teaching and learning prior to it going to the full board so that teaching and learning committee can ask questions? I think you guys had some great questions of the last two trips came up and it went to the full board and it was a lot easier to get approved than to vet it right at the board level.
For me, it's more issue from teaching and learning.
And I think to Ms. Baptiste Perez's point, if it hadn't been such a late submission, it would have been taken where there could have been the educational follow-up, not the last day of school. That was the only other available date, apparently.
I think that's the only thing that makes it problematic going to the committee and then the board is the fact that it happens at the tail end. And we got to get this thing approved because everything's set to go in 3 weeks. But if we're at the front end of it,
Right.
you have the time to be able to go through the committee, ask the questions, then you go to the full board, and then you start collecting money and doing all this other stuff you need to do.
And these trips, especially out-of-state overnight trips, no matter if it's within the bounds of the U.S. or abroad, they start planning these things way in advance. Way in advance. And I'm talking October, November, because they know that there's an expense that needs to be incurred and families may not be able to write a $500 check at once, so they pay an installment. So there's no reason why any out-of-state overnight trip cannot come to the board prior to planning.
Yeah, much better bring it like Mr. John said, that bring it, Ms. Batista, bring it early in the committee, ask the question, prepare yourself before you say yes outside, and then there will not have no consequence. All right, thank you, Mr. Zatani. No more question, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Yes, I have a couple. The first question I have, I'm going to table in my mind for a second because we're talking about something that's in the policy now with the educational takeaway, which I also took note of when I read this. Is this a place for when the field trip is being presented to teaching and learning now before the board, that in the presentation should be some material around the follow-up after they get back, how it's going to be integrated into the classroom?
Absolutely.
It feels like if we're going to put this as a requirement of this type of a trip, that should be part of the approval process, and this is how we're going to incorporate this into the lessons, or even the school day or wherever, posters or something where we're going to, not just posters, but something where we're going to bring it back. It feels like since we're talking about this and we're highlighting that this is already written into the policy, that it should become a part of that. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing is that was brought to my attention, I didn't think about the order of things. So ultimately, for an overnight trip where it has to come to the board's attention, prior to it, up until now, prior to it getting to the board, is it first coming through you, or what's happening?
No, it comes to the supervisor, whether now it's an executive director, whatever the title is. It comes to them at least 30 days in advance. So that's why that timeline is very tight.
So my question though is, so it always has been coming to somebody, maybe
Yes.
not you, but to
Right.
somebody. So is there an instance where that supervisor would decline it, but they would have the opportunity to appeal above the supervisor?
It would only be declined if the paperwork on the checklist wasn't all proper.
So it wouldn't be declined because of the nature of the trip,
No,
just because it didn't meet the checklist.
correct.
Okay. So now in this scenario, would it still be going to that supervisor first before it goes teaching and learning?
Well, they would be the one to look it over, make sure the checklist.
No. The way we're talking about it
Oh, it would go
It
to,
would go to
Right,
us for
So
the.
would it go to the supervisor first or straight to teaching and learning?
it would be submitted to my office to go on teaching and learning.
And
You
so
guys would give it this.
So when it comes to your office, it wouldn't be vetted, it would just be passed on to us.
Correct.
Okay, so basically, any overnight trip would come straight to the board. It wouldn't be vetted beforehand.
Correct.
Okay.
It becomes more like a conceptual, this is what we want to do.
Right.
Right.
Unless they said we want to do an overnight trip to,
For land ranch.
you know,
No, but that shouldn't be vetted though. That should be up to teaching and learning. So I guess that's what I'm
I
getting
didn't hear
at.
what he said.
No, I guess,
Neverland.
yeah, so all I'm getting at is, would there ever be a situation where the board wouldn't even know about a request?
No,
So it would always come to us.
the overnight trips would all come to you. Yes,
Even if it was a frowned upon trip, it would still come to us for us to say no to.
correct.
Okay. All right.
You guys may say,
We like it.
we like it. You don't know. what you're talking about.
Neverland.
And I'm okay with that. As long as it gets the stamp of approval to teaching and learning in the full board, then they can go on, plan it.
Right.
Then they submit their
And
checklist.
then the checklist goes through.
Right, and they make sure. So I think the checklist then can be submitted at least 30 days before, so that if there's anything missing, they
That's
have,
right.
right,
Doesn't matter about the deposit deadline anymore.
Right.
We have to take care of that.
right.
So now, did we say, were we talking about, so once the checklist is clear, it's all good,
Then they can
it
actually,
doesn't need to come back to the
No,
board? No, it's
no.
already done. It's pre-approved.
right.
Okay, all right.
So all these things, we'll need to figure out how the language will play out.
I would just say, as far as the language goes, whether or not it goes in there or not, in the event that there were some future changes from the tour company or whatever that were not part of the original pre-approval, say, because they haven't put the deposit down yet, and at the time comes, they put the deposit, oh, by the way,
That's on them then.
so I mean, does that have to be looked at by us again to approve that, the new changes? You know, like, I don't know what a change would
And
be.
yeah, and I know what he's getting. He's saying if Go Tours was sponsoring the trip and we approved it and they switch over to
That should
Gray
come
Line.
Back to the,
Yes. I think-
Or if some standard within Go Tours changed. Like maybe their COVID testing standard changed, or something changed that we had pre-approved and it's since changed. It's not the same pre-approval anymore. I'm not saying that happens. I don't do tours, but I can imagine something changing. And then
I
if all
think
of a
if it's a
sudden.
significant.
Yeah,
change,
so I'm wondering if that even needs to be mentioned in the wording, some type of significant change. But because if something was significant, we would never know. But yet we didn't pre-approve that. That's all I'm getting at, you know, so.
Yeah, I don't know if we want to get that
Deep, all right.
We,
Sorry.
no, I'm just throwing.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we're approving, like you said, a conceptual thing.
Conceptual.
We think this is a value and we're gonna get something out of this.
Got it.
And the nitty gritty operational stuff, that's up to the folks who are, if there's a sudden change and the group no longer feels that it's worthwhile, they'll stop.
Yeah, okay.
You know?
I was worrying I should stop doing that.
Yeah, I can see that going down a whole lot of rabbit holes.
Right.
And that's-
So I'll have to talk to legal
Mr. Chair?
commission to just, this language, right?
If not, one more thing, while I'm sitting here, I just saw one thing under planning considerations I want to ask about. On number 4, on 6201A.
Yep.
Transportation Department number, still valid way to go through there with us shifting to controls over to retransport.
Say that again?
It says, part of the process is if transportation is required, principal should submit standard bus request form to the Transportation Department at 203-576-8103.
Clean that up.
Joe, you are good.
Got a lot of time on my hands.
You're always this way.
Okay.
That's all I got.
Anything else? That's a good one. Good catch there. And then I'll make sure for an indemnification that the Bridgeport Board of Education is also listed, not just the city.
Okay, I think we have our respective marching orders. Next time.
There's some stuff that has to be cleaned up. So teaching and learning, Board of Ed approval prior to any deposits being collected.
And busing. Yeah, no, you got it.
And overnight field trips not anything out of state unless it's overnight. And then we got some cleaning up to do. You guys are very specific, whoever passed this the last time, that there was an acting assistant superintendent of student support.
Yeah, no,
You gotta get away from.
yeah, definitely gotta be more general.
Things change.
Superintendent or designee is always clean.
All right, is there a motion to adjourn?
So move.
So
By
moved.
Mr. Benahan, second. By Mr. Lombard, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, your adjourned time is 7:25.
Thank you.
Come and tell me how Germany was or
Yeah.
whatever have you.
No, but not just me, but for the students.
Well, that's
Those-
educational,
for the ones you were
educational.
talking about that